All right. So the game plan for today is going to build off of what we discussed last time. But first off, I want to quickly say some business stuff from last time, which is that we are going to, some people last time in class really said that they would like to have more classes. Therefore, I'm going to reinstitute Wednesday classes, but they're going to be completely optional. So if you want to come to class on Wednesdays, you are welcome to do so. It'll show you're interested, but in no way feel you have to. There are many other ways to get your participation grade up. But if you want to come on Wednesdays, feel free. It'll be a smaller group, presumably. I'm going to try to make it a little more discussion based. So definitely try, if you're going to come on Wednesdays, to be ready to talk. If nobody shows up, then I guess I won't have that class. But even if it's just like 3 of us, I'm willing to carry on and continue having it. All right. Any questions on that? Again, it'll be the regular link, regular class time. All that stuff will be the same as it was in the first half, only completely optional. I won't in any way. I mean, I guess in some sense, it's all semester's been optional, but will be extra optional. All right. Any other questions, comments, concerns, feelings, anything at this point? Okay, so the game plan for today is going to be to build off of what we discussed last class. So instead of just going on a different tangent, I'm going to kind of, I'd suggested I might focus on evil a bit more, but I decided to use that more as our jumping off point. And instead of looking at the impact of psychology on evil, I'm going to look more generally at the impact, and what we're going to look at more generally is the impact of psychology and psychological research on the entire field of philosophy in which we discuss things like good and evil. So, first question for the day. What's the discipline or subfield of philosophy that studies questions like what's good, what's evil, what's right, what's wrong?
Ethics.
Alan, did you come through? Is my volume not working?
Yeah, I think it might not be working.
Are other people hearing Alan, or am I the only one who's not hearing him?
Yeah.
Okay, you can hear him, I cannot. Awesome. That's really not ideal. So you're going to have to probably type out things because for some reason actually, you know what? Let me try this. Let me see why on earth this isn't coming through. This is going to I'm going to pause the video recording for a second. Okay. So where I was asking the question, what's the field of ethics in which we discuss good, evil, right, and wrong? The field of philosophy, good, evil, right, wrong. What is it called? Morals or ethics. So yeah, ethics. That is what we typically call the field itself in which these things are studied. How many of you have taken an ethics class? Out of curiosity. All right, awesome. What do you do in an ethics class? Describe what you did in an ethics class. Or how many of you have even thought about moral questions or ethical questions? And ethics we can kind of think of as the study of morality. So what do you do in an ethics class? Why would you take that class? What is the point behind it?
With us, I took it with Professor, I forgot his name. He's like the head of the department.
Haga?
Yes, there you go. What is Sarkisian or something like that?
Yep.
So I took it with him, and basically the first half the semester, or like the first third, he was just asking us like, okay, this is the situation, this is the thing, imagine it, now give your opinion. And then we kind of just read like one guy's opinion, like utilitarianism, and then we read like a rebuttal to utilitarianism, and then basically you're just getting like both sides of the argument, like what is right, what is wrong, and how to know what you're doing is right or wrong.
Yeah, that's a great description of it. And really what most of it comes down to is you start off with a bunch of questions which intuitively in our everyday mind we think are a moral question. Is this right? Is this wrong? So what are some of the examples that you either talked about in an ethics class or you've come across in other experiences as an example of a ethical question? The trolley problem is probably the most famous in or one of the most famously discussed, both in philosophy and then it made it into The Good Place, and now everyone knows the trolley problem.
We did the brother sister one too, the one from the reading.
Yeah, there's one in the reading, which we're going to come back to, but it's basically the way we do ethics, or the way ethics typically gets done, is what you do is you come up with some situation and you just think, like, what would I do? So describe the trolley problem for those of you who haven't thought about it before or aren't familiar with it. Anyone want to describe what the trolley problem is? Yeah, it's basically there's a train going along a track like this. Chugga, 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 choo choo. If you do nothing, the train is going to run over 3 people. But if you press a button, the train will. So imagine there's 3 people on the track. And over here, there's just 1. If you don't do anything, the train is, well, 3, 5, it doesn't really matter. You can come up with any number you want. So we'll just do 3 in this case. Most of the, you imagine you're standing here next to a button. The button changes which direction the train goes on. So if you don't do anything, the train goes this way and runs over 3 people. If you do something, the train goes the other way. It changes direction and only hits 1 person. And then the ethical question people ask is, well, what should you do? What is the right answer here? So what do most people think intuitively is the correct thing to do? Should you press the button or not press the button?
Yeah, I think intuitively it's kind of save the 5, sacrifice the 1.
Yeah, so how many of you share this feeling that the correct thing to do here is press the button, save the 5, kill the 1? The right thing to, you press the button. All right. So that's generally speaking what we do in ethics. Kill them all. Okay, well, that's another option, David. It's one you definitely could. Well, I actually don't know if practically you could. You'd have to attack them all. But generally speaking, why do you begin here in ethics? What is it that you're doing? What's the point of this thing? Why is it that we start asking weird things about what to do in trolleys? What's the next step that comes from this? You don't just sit around like all day and just go, what would you do if there were 46 people on the track? What if one of them is your mother? Like, you can do all of this, but it's supposed to be for a point. What's the point of it? What gets discussed? Why are we bothering with this?
To see the inconsistencies that we have.
Yeah, it's about seeing inconsistencies, and it's about basically finding the core values, finding the value of life, determine what we're valuing, what we aren't. It's basically about gaining insights into this thing, morality. So it's not just that we have a feeling of sorry. My screen just went blank. I'm just having all the tech problems today. So it's not just about like in by itself, like what would you do in a situation around a trolley? It's rather that this is supposed to teach you a lesson about things more generally. So in particular, it teaches us somehow that when we're deciding what's right and wrong, we seem to value numbers. We seem to think that 5 is better than 1. But if you change the situation, things are different. What if instead of just this, imagine it's these 5 people die, or you have to actually stab this person to death. So the only way these stay alive is you stab someone. And that's the only way, otherwise someone's going to kill 5 of them. You start to see that we have different views. You start to realize, the point at least, is that you're supposed to, from these sorts of judgments, draw something about morality in general, or our views in general. So does this make sense of what people have done in ethics classes, what you've done in ethics classes, and the way people go about doing ethics? Does all of this sound kind of familiar? So this is really the background. There's supposed to be something. So if we have these judgments, and the reason that these judgments are supposed to be valuable is that these judgments are supposed to track the moral facts. What is really right? What is really wrong? And generally speaking, what we try to do then is, through our judgments, try to find out what these general moral facts are, what the principles are that we should follow in our everyday lives. So, utilitarianism came up. What is utilitarianism as a view? It's one of the simpler of the ethical theories.
The ends justify the means.
Yeah, the ends justify the means. What does that mean, practically speaking? That's a general way of putting it. But what is the actual practical way, according to a utilitarian, of deciding what's right and what's wrong?
Like it doesn't matter what you have to do to get there. As that they're saying that minimize suffering.
Yeah, what makes something, or the reason that we have this judgment that in this case you go this way instead of this way, is what makes something right in general is that you minimize suffering and you maximize pleasure for a population as large. This is all, generally speaking, what goes into ethics. And really you can think of what ethics is as how should I behave / act. And it's about finding general principles that guide us in our way of deciding what to do. Now, this is really the background of all ethical discussions. This is where we begin. We start with these problems, we start asking. Someone might come along and come up with another strategy, but when you take an ethics class, you're generally looking at different views on like general principles you can follow that capture our judgments and which can then be used in new situations. So if you find yourself in a situation of, do you have to do this or do you have to do this? You can go and point back to, well, if I do this thing, this many people will be happy. If I do this other thing, far fewer people will be happy. Therefore, I should do the first one. So all of this is ethics. That's what you do in an ethics class. Now, there is, however, a few questions that come up that don't really get discussed that much in ethics because in a lot of ways we take them for granted. But what is a question you might ask at this point? I'll give you a clue. It has to do with the two things that are up on the board. You take an ethics class and you're sitting there and you're wondering, like, yes, maybe utilitarianism is right. Maybe it's a Kantian deontology. Maybe it's just that Mike makes right. But in each case, there's this assumption that you have these judgments and those judgments somehow track or follow the moral facts. What is a question that might come up at this point? For those of you who have taken an ethics class, maybe this is a question you've had.
I would say, like, what binds you to that decision?
So one thing is what binds you to that decision. So another thing, you might ask yourself, like, all right, I know the right thing to do is to push the button, but what binds me to that fact? So that's one thing you can definitely ask. Why is it that even if I know it's the right thing to do, I should really do it? Well, what's another question you might have? Maybe even a more basic question. Yeah, here's a question. These moral facts, wait, one question is, are there any, or more simply, where do they come from? So I have intuitive judgments about many things in my life. I have a judgment that if I look at something, I immediately open my eyes and I have a perception and it looks a certain way. And from that experience, I judge like, oh, that's the color black, or this is round. And in some sense, you can say, okay, so what is it that you're tracking when you have the judgment like this part of the marker is round? What's the way the light reflects off it and everything else? However, what sorts of facts are you tracking in these moral cases? Why is it the case that we have, like, what are these moral facts? Where do they come from? Or even more generally, are there any moral facts? Does anyone know, as soon as instead of just asking, how should I act, but rather, where do these facts which make it the case that something is right or wrong, which ones are they? Where do they come from? Does anyone know the subfield of philosophy that studies this? It was mentioned a couple times last week in the discussion, like in the chat. Meta-ethics. Yeah, meta-ethics. What meta-ethics is, well, how many of you, where have you seen this word before in philosophy? For those of you who haven't heard of meta-ethics before. There's a more famous metaphysics. So what you can think of metaethics is as just smushing together metaphysics of ethics. So what is metaphysics?
It's the physics of physics.
Yeah, it's basically the study of reality, or what's really there. So in the metaphysics, like sorts of questions that you typically study in metaphysics are things like, what is time? Or what is a person? In metaethics, you're instead asking things like, not what should I do in this case? Or what in this particular experience is the right choice of option? It's a more general question of what is rightness, or what is goodness? What makes it the case that something is right or wrong, good, bad, etc. And so that's the general idea of metaethics. So within metaethics, you can basically, there's a lot of different positions you can have and a lot of different questions. And basically all of them give different answers to what it is you're studying when you're doing ethics, or when you say that's right. What exactly do you mean, or what makes it the case that what you're saying is right? So for those of you who have taken a metaethics or come across it, or just thought about it, like Cassidy's question before, what are some of the questions that are going to come up? What are some metaethical questions that you might have at this point? So the way we can think of this is we can carve up the space in terms of questions you might ask. So if we start a metaethical inquiry into what is the nature of goodness or badness, or the nature of evil, or the facts that make it the case that something is evil, what's a question you might ask yourself at this point?
What is good? What is bad?
So what is good? What is bad? Or in a more specific thing is, I'm actually just going to steal Cassidy's from before. A first question you might ask is, are goodness and badness real things? Because think about it. When you're actually, like, how many of you have actually seen goodness out in the world? Like, seen it as in its essence, in the same way that, you can see a frog. Like, can you see goodness? What do we actually experience?
Representations of what we believe is good.
Yeah, we have this idea of this representation of what we believe is good. So I see somebody help a little old lady off across the street, and looking at that, I go, oh, that was a moral or good behavior. I see somebody in the experiments we talked about last time. I see somebody in the Milgram experiment shocking someone all the way to the highest level, and I think, oh, that's evil, or that's bad. But in what sense? Like, I have these judgments, but in what sense do we know that they're actually tracking something? Because there are many cases in which we can imagine things existing. We can imagine, ghosts. We see the workings of ghosts. The door shuts without my seeing it. Well, I saw the ghost acting. So why not think that goodness and badness are like that? Why are they, why think there's anything more to it than this? So, so the answer to these questions, if you believe that are they real things, anyone know what you'd call yourself if you fall into that camp? If you think they're real? In the most classically boring, yeah, a moral realist. So you're a moral realist. You believe there are moral facts. On the other side, anyone know what they're called? I'll give you a clue. It's basically the same as this with the word anti stuck in front.
Is it anti-realist?
It is anti-realist. So we've got this realist position, this anti-realist position. An anti-realist is going to say there is no such thing as goodness or badness. Rather, we just say things are good or bad, and really what they're doing is there's no moral facts. Rather, it's just we as people say these things, and really what we're talking about is something else. So this was something that came up last time with emotivism. One version of anti-realism is this belief that when you say that is good or that is bad. All you're actually saying, there's no fact of the matter you're tracking. Rather, you're just partaking in the same sort of verbal game you do when you go to a sports event and boo a team. So when you say murder is wrong, all you're doing is saying boo murder. Boo murder. And so, there's nothing more to it than that. That's all it is to say something's wrong. There's no, if all of a sudden everyone were to start cheering murder, there's no change of the world. It's just a difference in people's behaviors. A realist, on the other side, thinks that there is a fact of the matter as to whether you should or shouldn't press the button. According to the anti-realist, there's not even a fact of the matter. Like the question we're asking when we do the trolley problem is just something like it's a game we play. But really, at the end, there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. Maybe there's people who are going to look at you funny if you say the correct thing to do is kill everyone. But there's no right or wrong answer. A realist, however, is going to say there is a right or wrong answer here. Does this make sense? This sort of background bits. All right. Now, why am I bringing this up in this philosophy of psychology class? Well, one of the assumptions kind of built in to the realist, first off, generally speaking, most human beings, as they live, do they tend to be anti-realists or realists? Most of the people you run into in your everyday life.
Probably realists.
Yeah, most people are realists. And I'd be willing to bet most of you feel that way too. Like if I were to tell you that, do you want to do a poll of how many people think that morality is a real thing? How do I set up? No, I can't do a poll right now because for some reason my screen has decided to refuse to go to the normal size, and therefore I can't run a poll down at the bottom because it's not letting me. So if everyone wants to type in chat whether they identify as a realist or an anti-realist, we can, but I can't actually set up a poll right now because, of course, my damn Zoom is being a pain. So yeah, there are some people who are anti-realist, and I generally find that the average person, the more philosophy you take, the higher the chances are that you might be an anti-realist, but most people intuitively seem to be realists. And even those of us who have anti-realist tendencies, we still generally think that there's something very weird, and in our own behaviors, we tend to behave in realist ways. So for instance, if I told you that this weekend, what I did is I went out back and I caught a squirrel, and I skinned it alive, and I watched its pain and I laughed to myself. How many of you would tend to say what I did was wrong? How many of you feel that that is a thing you tend to say?
Just sounds like a fun weekend.
So for those of you who, not good, I should get it checked out. These are the things, most of us feel this way. Yet what would an anti-realist have to say? It's just what an anti-realist would have to say is, when you say this, all you're saying is maybe boo, or we play this fictional game called Good and Bad, but really there's nothing wrong with what you did. Picking flowers or going to the movies, exactly the same as skinning a squirrel alive and drinking its blood. Or eating babies. If you're an anti-realist, eating babies is the same sort of thing from a moral perspective as tying your shoes or giving to charity. They're all the same. So most of us at some level, and especially early on, are realists. We tend to think there's got to be some fact of the matter. And usually the way ethics works and the way ethical study happens is most people begin from this realist assumption, and then you do ethics to try to figure out what the right realist picture is. And part of the assumption here is, well, we know ethics are right. We know that this anti-realism position is wrong because, in large part, we have these very strong judgments of what's right, what's wrong, that are the same across all of our species. The vast majority of people, usually people who haven't grown up with traumatic childhood experiences think it's wrong to skin squirrels alive or drink blood of babies or punch random strangers for fun. Most of us feel this way. So we think like, oh, there must be some realist fact of the matter that is responsible for these judgments. Now, of course, realism is hard. And as any of you who have taken any sort of ethics class, this idea that there's a right answer is often much harder than finding out what the right answer is. So what are some of the issues that come up as soon as you try to go realist and say there is a right answer? What are some of the things you've in your ethics class or issues you've come across in other things that suggest maybe this realist position is less clear than we think?
It's like the piety thing with I forgot which Greek philosopher it was, but it's like
so one question you might have is, why is it, so one question is, so there's this question of piety, which is basically, you know what, I'm gonna try to avoid that question, but the piety one, just to put in the background, is do the gods love something because it's pious, or is something pious because the gods love it? And so there's this weird question here with this, which is something good because of some other facts? Or does it have those other facts because it's good? So one of the issues is it becomes really hard to actually say what these things are. Another issue that comes up is even though we all have similar sorts of judgments, they're not exactly the same. Not every one of our judgments is the same in every case. Especially if you want to find two people with different moral judgments about something like the death penalty, and you have like a time machine, where are you going to go to try to find situations where you have people who are disagreeing? What can you do if you have that time machine? Where might you go to find different views on these things?
Go to France where they were like chopping off people's heads.
Yeah, go to the French Revolution where people's heads were getting chopped off left and right. If you want even more, go back to ancient Rome where people were getting crucified all the time. Like, you did anything against the Roman government, go back to medieval times where torture was a typical way of doing just about anything. So if we have strong judgments of right and wrong, one issue that comes up is these cultural differences. So within the realist camp, there are questions like, is there a single objective right? Or is it relative to culture? And one thing you find with this is with the realists, with the relative to culture questions, you start to find that the line between realist and anti-realist gets a little blurred. However, even if you are a realist of any sort, including a cultural relativist, generally and a cultural relativist says what's right or wrong changes from culture to culture. So in ancient Rome, it was okay to kill people. It was okay to crucify people because that was what they did in the culture. In modern society, it's not okay. So, but in each of these cases, we generally think there is some moral fact that our judgments are tracking. And this is where the psychology comes in. Because what the psychology begins to point to is, so is cancel culture a form of realist ideology? I would tend to say yes. Within cancel culture is this assumption that if somebody else, so everyone know what we mean by cancel culture within internet culture? Just those of you who don't know, anyone want to give it a definition while I take a quick sip of water? Basically what cancel culture is when a celebrity or somebody comes along and says, you know, they say something that other people deem offensive or hurtful, and then the public as a whole comes out and says, well, that person should lose their job, that person shouldn't be in movies anymore, that person should, et cetera, et cetera. So for cancel culture to work, there has to be this assumption that there is a fact of the matter that what this person is doing is wrong, and therefore they should be kicked out. So if you built into like anti-racism is this view that racism is bad in some objective sense. And if you go anti-realist, things like anti-racism, things like anti-white supremacy become really hard to wrap your head around. What are you fighting for if you don't think there is actually something right or wrong in the world? So in these sorts of behaviors, there is an element of realism kind of in the background. Now, there is, however, this worry that we go back to, which is built into any sort of realism, is this assumption that when you have a judgment that's right or that's wrong, that judgment means something about ethics. It's tracking the ethical facts, or the way you come to this conclusion is you realize there's some effect behind this thing that caused you to have this judgment, and that judgment is somehow useful data for deciding what's right and wrong. And this is where the Singer reading comes in, where he talks about these psychological studies that have been done that really start to put pressure on the idea that our intuitive judgments of what's right and what's wrong are somehow tracking anything ethically significant. So I'm just going to read the first one of these from the reading, which is, this is a situation that was given to people in experiment. So here's the situation. Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They're traveling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night, they are staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decided it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them because they're brother and sister. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy making love, but decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret between them, which makes them feel even closer to each other. What do you think about it? Was it morally okay for them to make love? How many people are in the no camp? Raven said no. How many other people feel this way? All right, most people have this. So we have one okay. And I've done enough like weird ethics that I'm also in the okay camp, but I'm not sure how I feel about that. But the no camp. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anybody else in the no camp? Anyone else want to say?
Wait, you said brother and sister?
They're brother and sister. That is the key thing. They're brother and sister. They have sex together. However, she's on birth control. He is. He also uses a condom. And on top of that, afterwards, they decide never to do it again. But they find that it's their special secret between them, and they now feel closer together than ever before. So we have we have 3 okays, another no. All right, those of you who say no, why do you say no? What is it? Now, just the background here is, if this judgment is supposed to be tracking a case of rightness and wrongness, then there should be some fact, something in the world which makes it the case that this is right or wrong. Something out there which made it wrong. All right, Marie.
I think Alan sums it up pretty well. Your intuition says no. I feel like because of just like cultural norms and like what you hear about, I know the reading refutes this, but what you hear about like inbreeding and stuff like that, so your intuition says no, but your logic says yes, because it's like, I would say like even somebody who's like a cannibal or something like that, like you would think like, I don't know, it's complicated, but like you would think like no, but if people are consenting to that, then it's like, it's hard to say no to that. I don't know.
So what you're putting into language is exactly what I think the core issue is, which is we have this gut feeling like, ew, like, no, don't have sex with your brother, don't have sex with your sister. These aren't the relations someone is supposed to have with their family members. But then the question is, well, why aren't you supposed to have those relations? What is the reason behind it? Is it just something like, I mean, let's be clear, it is incest. It's not sounds like incest. This is literally the definition of incest. Is it in this circumstance okay to have incest? And one thing you might say is, well, you're not supposed to engage in incest. The question is, why not? Why shouldn't you engage in incest? What makes it the case that incest is wrong? Marie, is this another follow-up?
Oh, no, I didn't.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to make sure I didn't skip you if you were asking another question. So why are they not supposed to have, to play devil's advocate here, Raven, why are they not supposed to have sex with each other? What is it that makes it wrong for these siblings to have sex?
Well, in the reading, it said inbreeding was a problem, but they're both on birth control, so they refuted that.
Yeah, so exactly, they're both on birth control. So here's exactly the thing, is like, we're beginning to say like, okay, I guess they could, I guess it's more like, also, let's be clear, what we're discussing here is all of us are slowly coming around to the idea that having sex with your system is okay, or sibling is okay. We're all slowly coming around that as long as you follow the right principles, banging your brother or sister is okay. And I'm not sure how we're supposed to feel about that, but that's really what we're all starting to do. Conrad, you have a hand?
It's morally not justifiable in my opinion, because it goes into the disregarding inbreeding, because that was also like disregarded in the reading. But my opinion of this matter is that it goes into the section of grooming, where in the sense of you have these two people who know and trust each other for their whole life, and you might view certain people in your family as role models and things of that nature. So at that point, it goes into the section where you're not supposed to groom people who are underage in order to have sex with them when they are of age.
But
So
in this case, the kind of bill, so I totally understand that reasoning, where like if one of them was exploiting the power dynamic, like if you have an uncle who's having sex with a young girl who's not in a position to consent, I can totally understand. But built into this case is this assumption that they are both consenting adults who but let's go, we could assume that they were separated for their whole childhood, but let's assume they grew up together. And even built in is the fact that after this happens, they're both happy it happened. They both say this brings us closer together. And I think what's starting here is Alan is saying this is a victimless crime. If they agree to make them feel closer, there's no threat to the relationship, and they agree never to do it again. So there's no sense of perpetuity or any sense of control. They both, you can assume, go on and have a regular life. It's, I don't think we. And so what ends up happening is as you begin to peel away the layers, we start to realize maybe what exactly was it initially that made me feel wrong about this? Why was it the case that we feel so bad? And maybe you can keep pushing, but generally it seems like it's very difficult to find a reason that it's wrong that you can't respond to or explain away. Like you might say something like, it's an example of grooming. Well, let's build into the case that it's not grooming. How do you feel now? Marie.
Oh, sorry. I feel like when I hear this case, it feels weird because it is blood, but I also feel like it's a case of the law. Like the law has conditioned us to think that incest is something that's illegal and that we shouldn't do. And it's like this taboo. So I feel like it's also what is prescribed to us as right or wrong by the law has shaped it too.
So I think you're entirely right that the law shapes our views. But there's a problem here, which is if our judgments of what's right and wrong are shaped by what the laws happen to be, why on earth are we listening to what's right and wrong? Remember, right and wrong is, where does the law come from? Why do we have laws? And I'm asking this as a literal general question. Where does the law come from? Why do we have the laws we do?
Just like an agreement between members of society that these are the rules that we all agree to and agree to follow.
And generally speaking, why do we end up with a particular law? So for instance, when the new COVID relief package that is going through Congress right now, Why is that becoming a law? What was the motivation behind it? Why did the Biden administration think we want this? Yet laws are usually reactionary. And what are they reactionary to? What sorts of things go into our judgments of it? Why is there a law against murder? We all have a murder law. Why is that there? What, if you were to justify the reason for that law's existence, what might you say? Why is murder illegal? Social cohesion, maximizing the right to life, or simply put, it's wrong to murder. So part of the reason we seem to have the laws we do is because we think that there's moral facts underlying them. So for instance, why did we get rid of slavery in this country? We got rid of slavery because after many years, the main push was slavery is wrong. We shouldn't have it. We changed the laws to reflect morality. So there's this issue here, which is, well, I think Marie is right that very often our judgments about what's right and wrong track the law. You can worry, does that mean that our judgments are actually tracking some moral fact of the matter? Is there really a fact of the matter they're tracking? Or is it coming from some other element? Back to the incest case. I think Lino's right, there's this biological aspect in which we start to think like maybe we're just programmed not to yeah, it falls under Height Sanctity Foundation, where it just seems like, actually, Grace, remind me what the Sanctity Foundation is.
In the book where that issue comes up, the Sanctity Degradation Foundation is like disgust, shame,
Okay.
like our value of our body, like religion, but it's like it's grown into so many different things in modern time.
Yeah, so you're spot on. I'm going to save the response. Like, I'm going to take what you just brought up with the Sanctity Foundation in about 5 minutes once I've like poked a little bit more at these issues. Because what we start to realize is we have this idea of maybe there's a biological aspect in which we are biologically designed to not want to have intercourse with our siblings. But there's also many other things that we're biologically not designed to do that we do anyway. You know, we're not biologically designed to go to space, but we do that anyway, and we think it's kind of cool. So there's this worry of saying like, all right, well, maybe you're supposed to have it. Maybe that supposed comes from your culture or your laws. But once you start doing that, you can see that we're beginning to pull away this idea that there's some moral fact of the matter that this is tracking, as opposed to what's really going on. We're biologically designed to do cool things. That is a valid point. But cool, I think, becomes a vague term here. But you might also say there's a biological or evolutionary issue. So the reason why is we're biologically designed not to have sex with our siblings. But the thing is here, do we really want to say that morality is grounded in biology in this way? Because, you know, biology didn't take into account some of the factors like birth control and things like that. So what we're beginning to see, yeah, philosophy is definitely the one class where we're going to spend time on incest and baby eating and various other things. But here's the point of this argument. It's just trying to put pressure on the idea that there's some fundamental fact of the matter that we're tracking with these judgments, as opposed to that we just have these judgments. Because remember, if we go back over here, we have this idea of moral fact, and these are objective, true something. And then on top of that, we then have these judgments. And the judgments are the way we learn what the moral facts are. But if it turns out that there's some other explanation for where these judgments come from, they're tracking something else, then why should we think that our judgments matter for what's right and wrong? And this is where the Height Sanctity Foundation stuff comes in. Because what psychologists have found is that the parts of the brain that are correlated with moral judgments seem to be the ones tied in with not some high level understanding of the value of a human life and how much you should care about someone, not this high level stuff around, treating someone as an end in themselves, not simply as a means. It rather seems to come from these very low level things like the disgust reaction. So the reason why what happens is, we are capable of feeling disgust. If I were to just vomit all over the screen right now, you'd all feel kind of grossed out. In the same way, when I tell you, imagine this case of brother and sister having sex, you have a disgust reaction. And that reaction alone, this pure visceral feeling, just causes you to then immediately find this feeling of, oh, this is gross. And then if somebody asks you from that grossness feeling, you come to the conclusion, wrong. And then what happens is you then spend a lot of time, if somebody asks you, well, why did you think it was wrong? What you'll do is provide a post hoc explanation. Do people know what a post hoc explanation is? It's kind of the justification you give for something after the fact. It didn't actually play a role in you deciding to do what you did, but rather you'll kind of try to explain why you did it or why you felt that way. So in this case, what really caused you to think it was wrong is simply that you had a disgust reaction. And a post hoc explanation, you then come along and say, well, incest is wrong because it can lead to deformed children and inbreeding, or incest is wrong because it's going to lead to harm. And what we find is what really was going on is this disgust reaction. And there's a lot of other psychological evidence that suggests what's really the driving force behind these judgments are these sorts of low-level emotional feelings, not some high-level tracking of the moral facts of the matter or what's going to cause the greatest amount of good for the greatest number. So there are two other experiments or two other things mentioned in the reading that kind of point in the same direction, that what determines our judgments of right and wrong is just these low-level emotional disgust sorts of feelings. So did anybody pick up from the reading on what the other two pieces of evidence were that Singer points to? One of them is our dear friend with the pipe through his head.
Phineas Gage.
Yeah, Phineas Gage. And everyone, I'm going to put Phineas Gage at all. And then the other one were these experiments, the trolley cases by Green. I can never remember his first name, but that's the readings for next week are two sections from, can never remember Green's first name, but his dissertation, Joshua Green, yes. Josh Green's dissertation, that's the reading for next time. The Phineas Gage case. What is the Phineas Gage case? I think I talked about it earlier in the semester, but for those of you who don't remember, anyone who does remember want to give it for everybody else?
It was the guy who got a pipe through, like it ran through his head, and he survived, but his personality changed. Like he wasn't able to control his impulses.
Yeah, and so did this guy's reasoning ability change at all? Was he less good at math? Did he have a hard time? No, he was just as good at all this stuff. All that changed was his personality. And actually what happened is the part of the brain that was crushed is a part that's very closely tied in with emotion and impulse control. So they found that Gage, and they've since done, looked at people with similar, I can never remember, let me see if I can find the brain section. Where is it? The ventromedial portion of the frontal lobe. So the ventromedial section of the frontal lobe. Now, don't ask me, I don't know my brain that much. You remember from the second class when I tried to draw a brain. But basically, they've done work, and this is the part that was heard in Phineas Gage, and it's also the part that they've looked at other people with this similar bit. And what they find is this is the part that controls emotions. So what they find is people who have this part missing don't get a feeling of disgust. Like if you were to put poop in their face, they don't have that immediate disgust reaction, which is suggesting that the reason that Phineas Gage didn't have, like, he had trouble with morality. He didn't, things that he used to think were wrong, he no longer thought of as wrong. Similarly, people who are have damage to the ventral medial section, if you show them pictures of like a war zone of body parts blown up and you tell them who did it, they don't feel anything. They don't have that sense of, oh, that's terrible. It's more just like, oh yes, that is a foot. So this is suggesting that whatever's underlying our feelings of right and wrong, good and bad, in these cases, is again, this low-level emotional impulse control stuff. It's not some higher level, we somehow know the nature of rightness through our underlying connection through the undying soul. No, it just seems like we're programmed in some way or trained to feel disgust about certain things for whatever cultural reasons or for whatever reasons, and then we use that to explain, we then go about afterwards trying to explain why that's the case. And then the trolley cases, Green's version of the trolley cases is basically, there's a famous version of the trolley cases, which is supposed to show that more goes into our moral calculations than simply the fact that we count numbers. So in the original version, it's the track divides 5-1. Then the second version of it that came along, the loop version is the third, which we'll mention. But the second version is the person on the footbridge version of it. So the person on the footbridge version is, once again, there's 5 people down here and a train coming along. But instead of being able to push a button, you have to physically push a person who falls in front of the train. And how very often, what is the judgment? What are people's own intuitive feelings? Is it okay to push this person in front of the train? Is it okay, rather than just pushing a button, to physically push a stranger to stop the train with their dead body? Yeah, most people have this feeling that there's something about the pushing that is different. And does anyone who took an ethics class know the big ethical reasons that people often try to give for why this is different? Conrad, is that a hand?
Yeah, I remember a sociological experiment with the obedience, where when people are given there's this diffusion. So for example, here with the train tracks, you push a lever or you push a button, and there's no direct contact or a direct view of your actions. It's more over through a medium.
Yeah, so there are 2 different types of explanations that could be given. One is a pure psychological explanation, and the other, so that's number 2. Number 1, the other one though that philosophers often try to give is this sort of moral explanation, that the reason we have different judgments here is because of something about the fact we're using this person as a tool, and that's somehow wrong. Or because you're physically pushing them, that's using them without taking them into account. And so it feels more like murder. And there's this division that people try to draw between killing or murdering versus letting die. And there's this argument that these are fundamentally ethically distinct views, or they're somehow ethically importantly different. This murdering side versus this letting die side, and that shows us something very important about ethics. However, when Green asked people to do these studies, he put them in an MRI. So it wasn't just you did the trolley problem and then you did the other trolley problem. It was rather you do one trolley problem and then you do the second trolley problem. And in both cases, we see which parts of your brain light up while you're doing it. And if there was an actual ethical, if there's an actual ethical difference here between murdering and letting die, of the philosophers sort of, we somehow understand this fundamental rational difference between the two, then you'd expect to see a lot of activation in like the parts of your brain that are responding to higher order thought, while in these so the letting die case, you wouldn't have that activation. The murdering case, you would. But when we actually when Green actually looked at the experiments, and he actually looked at the brain place that lit up, anyone know which brain part lit up for this version? Based on what I just talked about in the last two? Anyone have a guess as to which parts were lighting up? Was it some higher order, very intelligent, calculating people's lives, that sort of thing? Yeah, it was the low-level emotional stuff. It was basically just that disgust reaction again. And so it seems like, once again, it's not what's driving us is some understanding of right and wrong, but rather this emotional low level, we just have a disgust feeling, and we just have a ugh response to it, and then we try to justify it later in terms of big words. So let's pull back for a second and discuss what on earth then are the implications of these findings. Should I care if my judgments of what's right and wrong are really just tracking my disgust response? Is this a problem? Why is it a problem? What does it say about the nature of ethics? Anybody have views on this?
I would say that it does matter because all of us have a different tolerance for this, like disgust level of tolerance or whatever. But yeah, so like it varies by person, so we can't come up with like a universal rules that we all must follow.
Yeah, so if what disgust is going to depend on is what we're like, then that means that really what determines whether something's right or wrong in different people is going to simply be our tolerance with disgust. And that's a really weird situation, because the way people typically think about morality is that there's a fact of the matter up here that's the same for everyone, and it determines what's right for you, and it determines what's right for you. And not only does it determine what's right for you, it also explains why you have the judgments you do. Well, it's starting to look like, well, this isn't what's explaining our judgments. It's rather our ability to be disgusted. So if you're somebody who's got a really strong stomach, you don't mind when babies get killed. Here's another thing. How do you deal with punishment? Where do we put punishment into this question? Because why do we punish someone who murders? Well, we do it because it's wrong generally. This is what we talked about a few times ago. Marie.
Isn't it also influenced by like if you find something adorable, like people would rather, like they wouldn't kill a dog, but like most of us would eat chickens or something.
Yeah, here's another issue is just like, what animals should you and shouldn't you eat? Why don't you eat human being? What's your reasoning for not being a cannibal?
I don't know how to cook it.
Okay, so if you were offered, if I offered you a very like I got like a celebrity chef, the best chef in the world, who gave you a piece of ethically sourced human meat that was guaranteed this person was not sick, they happened to die in a car accident, and before they died, they wrote out on their will, I would like somebody to eat a piece of me. How many of you would be willing to eat this piece of human meat? No. For those of you who say no, if I were to eat it, what would you think of me? Would you feel a judgment towards me? And if so, why? Like if I was just like, yeah, I ate my neighbor who died in a car accident. So again, intuitively, yes, logically, no. And it seems like, yeah, and there are always these cases in which, generally what we're starting to find here though is, sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a second. I need a sip of water because I think I'm getting dizzy and dehydrated. But the idea here is, that the more you, the libertarian in you doesn't care. It looks like what's starting to happen is the more you push on it, the more you take the psychology into account, the more it starts to look like what is determining this. And in the cannibalism case, in most cases, it's literally just the disgust reaction again. People will maybe give explanations like you might get sick or something like that. But again, if you build in those cases, you can make it that it's, again, a victimless crime where we no longer seem to have these strong feelings. So the question at this point is when you start to see where our judgments come across psychologically, you start to worry, does this mean that there is no such thing as morality? Or at the very least, is this, if there's a thing morality, why on earth, like, what is it doing for me? What is it doing? If my judgments aren't tracking what's actually right and wrong, then how do I find out what's right and wrong? Is there a right and wrong? And so that's why these sorts of issues are, I think, powerful and important to think about in a psychology, how this psychology setting goes onwards and has more impact on these ethical sorts of questions. So if we find so Alan asked the question of, if we find a serial killer's brain was messed up, do we still look at them as monsters? So I think there's two questions here, which is one, will we, as a matter of fact, still think of them as a monster? But then I think another issue is just, to what degree does this word even have any more meaning? And it seems like most of us want to say there's something wrong with a serial killer. And the reason why is because there's some moral fact of the matter that they are ignoring. But as soon as you start to put pressure on where do our psychological judgments come from, and once you start to have this idea that our moral judgments aren't tracking some facts, but are rather just in the same sort of way that if you see a pile of poo, you feel grossed out, you hear somebody murdered someone, you feel grossed out, is that really enough justification to come to the conclusion that serial killers are wrong in some more important objective sense, that they're monsters? It seems like we no longer even get to talk about monsterness. We just get to talk about people who happen to make us feel disgusted. And if I had grown up differently, I wouldn't have felt the same way. And you can see how the moment pushing on these judgments, the whole like meta-ethical framework begins to break down, and you start being pushed towards this sort of anti-realist position. Because part of what gets us off the ground with realism is this like absolute conviction that what this person is saying must be wrong. Any other questions on this stuff for right now, or any other feelings, ways in which why we should or shouldn't be concerned by these sorts of findings? Or something as simple as, do you think that if you found out that the main, like, if it's true that the main driver of our judgments is simply these disgust reactions, does that mean we should go all the way to anti-realism? Should we really just say morality is not real? Or should we say that maybe it's different than we thought? Maybe we just need to factor these factors out? Basically, I'm tired of hearing my own voice and want to hear somebody else's.
I feel like I don't want to go all the way to anti-realism because it has some issues. I mean, I feel like, again, I'm jaded because I would be fine if somebody like killed a cow, but like I wouldn't be fine if they killed a baby. So I do think that I do have that bias there from whatever I'm conditioned about. But I feel like I'm wary to say like, let's go all the way to anti-realism.
Yeah, so what we're gonna actually, so just to give you all a view, because as a matter of fact, there are people who recognize these sorts of findings, like Singer, and Singer doesn't want to go all realism. In fact, of all the like realist philosophers today, he's one of the most outspoken, demanding that we do good things in the world. And he thinks we have a very strong moral obligation to do things like give huge amounts of money to charity. It's just that he thinks that when we're deciding on what's right and wrong, we need to throw out our judgments and our intuitive judgments. And he's going to say that from an ethical standpoint, the different versions of the trolley problem are the same. Really, all you have to be a hardcore utilitarian, and for this reason, you literally, it makes no difference if you're pushing someone in front of a train, if you're stabbing them yourself, all of it's the same. It's just these higher level principles, and what these sorts of judgments show is simply that we can be led astray. Our judgments can be something we have to ignore. And this goes back to something, I feel like this quote has been attributed to every dictator in the history of the 20th century, but it's this quote of I've heard it attributed to Stalin most commonly. 1 death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a statistic. And I think we all have this experience. Like, what hurt you more, or what did you feel more, when somebody you knew died of COVID, or when you heard the number 500,000 people? Which one strikes you more to the core? Yeah, the former. Finding out one person personally. But from a higher level, what should concern us more, that 500,000 people died or that someone close to us died? What really, if we're thinking about, yeah, it seems like in some sense, we should somehow, if 1 death causes that much pain, 1 million deaths should cause a lot more. And yet for some reason, the way our brain works is somehow we come to this point of concluding that this one's worse, because this is the one that has more of an emotional impact on us. So Singer's response, which we'll talk about more on Wednesday, we're going to talk about the 2 different versions of this sort of view, where Green goes hardcore anti-realist and wants to say, well, then this shows that ethics shouldn't exist, and we need to get rid of ethics as we typically understand it, while Singer wants to say, judgments are fast, which is one of the parts that we had problems we had with the prototype theory. So yeah, another thing you might say then is that these sorts of judgments, which is what Singer wants to say, is these fast judgments shouldn't play a role in ethics. We need to get rid of them, because the meta-ethical understanding is of something that isn't what we're tracking when we form these judgments. It's almost like, here's the ethics, here's what I should do, and then over here is some other thing, which is judgments. And that if we really want a better world, and if we want happiness and we want success, we have to ignore these things. And we have to stop being led astray and instead be very unfeeling in our judgments of what's right and wrong. So yeah, and it's almost saying that the only way you can be a moral person is to be a stoic, to put these emotions behind us. And so part of the thing you'd have to say here is, if you're Singer, who for years has been saying give more of your money to charity, and he gives a ton of money to charity, but most of us aren't. One worry you might have is, well, if Singer's right and ethics tells us what we should do, but we've got these underlying judgment forces that are really driving us, then we're screwed. Like, we are just going to blow ourselves up. And I think there are times where you look at what happens around the world and you see the way in which emotions are controlling our judgments of what's right and wrong. And you begin to wonder whether we are, as a species, driving off a cliff. But I think that this is something that is worth talking about more. So, yes. So let me pause here. What I want to say is a couple things. One of them is what we're going to be doing on the optional class. And then the other is what are we going to be doing on the next week's class. Again, if you don't care about what's happening next week or on the optional Wednesday class, aka 2 days from now, feel free to leave. Class officially dismissed. But if you want to know what we'll be doing over the next couple classes, here's the game plan. For Wednesday, we are going to continue on this, in which we are discussing the ideas of realism and anti-realism and how should we conclude from these sorts of general things. If this isn't a topic that interests you, feel free to skip. Again, next week, I'm going to go even a step further, which is going to be looking at the fun psychology of free will, or at the very least, our experience of choice. So you and I are going about our everyday lives, and you decide what is going to happen. Am I having the cake for dessert, or am I going to have the apple for dessert? Well, it looks like if you, in your everyday life, it seems like what's making the decision is your conscious experience. You have this decision. However, there's all this new research which suggests that really the experience or the choosing happens prior to anything reaching the level of consciousness. And so what does this mean for our experience of what it is to be human? What does it mean for our experience of doing the right thing? Does it mean that, like, are we really just these unconscious monsters that do, or unconscious machines that do lots of things, and then our experience is just along for the ride? So that's what we'll be talking about next week. This week is going to be finishing up these ideas around realism and anti-realism. All right, so that is it for now. If you have any questions, feel free to stick around, and otherwise I will see you all on Wednesday if you want to, or next week.